Welcome. I'm Dee Wolfsbane, and this is Story of the Game, a podcast where I take hours of real D&D adventures and weave them into oral narratives for your entertainment. Last time, on the Disappearing Debacle arc, we left our adventurers as they bedded down in Skagakur. On the way to the core village, they'd investigated a cave that seemed to be linked to the Vesson tribe, which Yenna and Yaman were a part of. Talking with Mebo in the core village later, they learned that Ulagan Vesson was one of the 3 founders of Skagakur and might have been responsible for the cave. They also learned of the attack on the Aisahrakur Monastery that had happened the previous day, and that Sago, the leader of the monastery, was now missing. During the day, they received a lovely tour by Yenna and Yama's niece, Nithni, who showed them to all her favoriteest of places, including the Eternal Flame in the town square, the Oracle of Skreppa's hut, and her own secret hideout in the woods. Now, as a new day dawns, most of the party is waking up in the Silver Scythe, and they'll be joined there by Yenna and Ferox, who had slept on cushions in the main area of the Vesson dwelling. What secrets and surprises are in store for the group today? Let's find out as we jump into the next episode of Story of the Game. Let me tell you a story of love and loss. The lost city of Aisahrakur, and a fight against this huge dragon. Mykolas, the trickster. Of wild magic. Of a plague that swept through. Dragons, I say. The orb of time. Of a hopeless guild. There was this bard. And this is what happened. Everyone met at the Silver Scythe for breakfast. The boys went up to the monastery as Yenna took the girls to the Oracle of Skreppa's hut that was hidden in one of the floating island's forests. As Clotho, Oriana, Carrick, Ferox, and Yenna all approached the little hut, Clotho cast Detect Magic, which would last for the next 10 minutes. This would enable her to ascertain what magic the Oracle was using. Now that they were set, they knocked on the door, upon which a starburst pattern was engraved, the symbol of the Skreppa tribe. Coming, coming! They heard the shuffling of a chair and feet before the door creaked open. The Oracle was dressed in black, a cowl shaded her face, but her white eyes, pupilless and irisless, shone brightly from beneath. A blue sapphire-like pendant swung from her neck as she invited them in, as if expecting them all along. The Oracle directed the girls to settle at a table, prominently placed in the middle of the room. The table was covered with a tablecloth that was embroidered with dodecahedral lines across the middle. Some sat, some stood, as the Oracle busied herself making tea for her guests. When the tea was steeped, she placed it down and took a seat with the girls. Only Ferox and Yenna tried the tea. The others just pretended like they were drinking, though didn't actually. Ferox managed to hold back her gag reflex and swallowed the horrible-tasting herbs. "It's good," she said, trying not to choke. Satisfied that they accepted her hospitality, the Oracle asked who would like a reading. For a modest fee of 5 silver pieces. First up, our tiefling warlock Oriana wanted to know what the Oracle knew about the disappearances in the village. After a long-winded explanation, where the Oracle tried to make it sound like she knew what was going on without actually saying anything of substance, Clotho realized that this Oracle had no magic. Her Detect Magic spell confirmed as much. Unfortunately, she couldn't yet communicate this with the rest of the group, so when Oriana was done, she stepped aside and gave Ferox a turn with the Oracle. The Dragonborn Druid was pushed unceremoniously forward by an eager and amused Carrick, who, out of the entire group, was the only one who actually knew that Yenna and Ferox liked each other. Ferox asked the Oracle for a general reading, and the Oracle, reading her body language, told Ferox that love is to be found, and that she was experiencing the first stirrings of romance. Ah, what it was to be young and in love. She told Ferox that she should keep pursuing this romance, for Ferox's love interest was also interested in a relationship with her. Trying not to blush and not look Yenna in the eye, Ferox thanked the oracle before Clotho ushered everyone out. Once back in the woods, with the morning sun gaining heat, Clotho politely pulled the party aside, away from Yenna, to have a private conversation. There, Clotho informed the others that this oracle was a dud, and that in this instance, the oracle didn't have any actual real magic. She'd just been reading their body language. When Ferox sheepishly glanced to Yenna off on the side and asked if Clotho was sure, it finally clicked into place for Clotho and Oriana. Ferox liked Yenna.
Ship!
Yeah, my players had started to chant again, because, well, at this point, they were very invested in making this relationship happen. And so, they got their characters to have a quick conversation about how best to ship Ferox and Yenna. Meanwhile, Grim, Kumi, and Lucifer hiked up the narrow switchbacks to the massive and impressive mountain alcove that was the entrance to the Aisahrakur Monastery. 2 monks flanked the entrance, with staves butted into the rocky ground, standing vigil. The 3 approached and explained why they were here. They wanted to help, but to do so, they needed to know what happened. One of the 2 junior monks went to grab a more senior monk, who came back, and having heard of this group already through the grapevine of the town, invited the group into the monastery and acted as their guide. Following instructions, the group removed their shoes and placed them in cubbies in the alcove, before continuing inside through the large entrance doors that had been carved out of the mountain rock. They immediately entered a huge cavernous space, 120 feet long, 80 feet high, with massive pillars keeping the mountain aloft. As the doors closed behind them, they noticed that it was brighter than it should have been in the cavernous hall, considering that the only light was from the morning sun that shone through from some holes in the mountain above, very much like it had in Melora's life spring. It was a worshipping type of silence that hung inside, and as they walked up to the front of the cavernous hall, they passed small pillars with various artifacts that rested upon them, vases, masks, glaives, and many other artifacts from the core society. As they reached the front of the hall, they could see more clearly the massive carving that was on the front wall. The carving depicted a huge sun from above, shining rays of light on the core beneath, all of whom had their arms up, embracing the light. And though the carving seemed to glow, light wasn't actually emanating from them. Underneath the carving was a basin of water. The senior monk explained that first they had to purify themselves by cleaning their face with the blessed spring water before they could enter the temple proper. So each of them did this in turn, ending with Kumi. It was against Kumi's rogue order to remove his mask at any time besides during a full moon. But, deciding to honor the traditions of the core monastery to which he entered, he made an exception and removed his mask to cleanse his face before replacing it back where it should be. Vela led them through the corridors of the monastery. They passed places for training, for meditation, the kitchen, until finally they came to the place they were looking for, the library. But it wasn't neat and orderly, as it probably had been 3 days prior. No, instead, it was a scene of carnage. The 50-foot-long room, which had once held books on rows of simple shelves, was now torn asunder by a furious battle that had taken place just over a day before. Large claws had decimated the shelves and scarred the walls. Fire had scorched the area and burned many of the books that had once held great knowledge. Bloody corpses were strewn about, of horned beasts with pointed tails of various sizes, including some smaller red ones and large white ones with spikes across their entire body and dangerous stinger-like tails. These had been the attackers that Sago had felled before going missing, and he had managed to kill quite a few. Now, just a quick aside for those of you who recognize the description of these entities, and for anyone else who's just interested in a bit of D&D lore. These entities, these corpses, are fiendish devils. And yes, I realize I made a mistake. You see, when devils die, they're supposed to go up in sulfurous smoke and dissolve into piles of black ichor, as they're transported back to the Nine Hells to reform in a new body. And right now, these guys are corpses, not ichor. Oops. So, I'm just going to say, for argument's sake, that this area is consecrated, holy land, and as such, the devils were prevented from reforming in the Nine Hells, and actually died in the monastery on this material plane. Yeah, I'm going to go with that. Anyway, back in the temple, Grim, Kumi, and Lucifer spread out around the sundered library, investigating the area. They realized that the devil's corpses were concentrated around a door on the side that led to one of the alcoves, though none appeared to have been able to get through that particular door. They noticed that this was one of many doors, but they seemed to have focused on this particular one. Each door had a different tribe symbol above it, and the door where all the devils were scattered about belonged to the Vesson tribe. They asked the senior monk Vela about the alcove and the attack. The senior monk said she'd been awakened during the commotion and had come to see Sago fighting off these devilish creatures. She went to get help, but by the time she returned, the battle was done, and Sago was gone. Nodding at this information, Kumi, our white-masked assassin, tried to enter the Vesson side room, but was blocked by an invisible force. It was very much like walking into an invisible wall, so definitely felt that on the nose. Vela explained that only those pure of heart could enter these rooms, meaning those of good alignment, for those of you who like D&D mechanics. Grim couldn't enter the room either, probably because he may or may not have been talking about eating humanoids in the past. It was only Lucifer, our elven child cleric, who could get in right now. Lucifer went into the tiny room. There were shelves of books that had been made by the Vesson members, but on a pedestal prominently in the middle of the room rested a very old, very worn-looking book. Lucifer stepped up to it and flipped through the pages, while Grim and Kumi went to look at the fiendish corpses. Kumi decided to take one of the devil's tail stingers as a souvenir. He had plans for it later. But as they searched through the corpses, they realized that they were not scorched like the books around. No, they appeared to be ripped apart by huge claws. This is roughly when the girls arrived. Ferox had a little bit of a glow and was standing a bit further away from Yenna than normal, still a tad embarrassed by the fact that now all the girls knew that she liked Yenna. Clotho immediately went to check the books, trying to find ones that hadn't completely been charred by the fire that had destroyed the library. Mebo had told Clotho the previous day that some of the books in the library were by core wizards and might have the spell she was looking for. The knock spell, the one that would get her into the cave around the mountain. So, she enlisted the help of anyone in the group who was willing, trying to find the spell in whatever book could still be read. And now, we're going to step outside the game a moment for a spell spotlight, presenting Knock. The second level, Transmutation spell. Knock is a spell which can be cast instantaneously to open any lock within 60 feet of you, and all you have to do is say the word, "Open Sesame." Now, this is perfect for any mundane or magical lock. It could be on a door, a box, a chest, or it could just be a simple padlock. Ooh, like this. It's also great if you don't have a rogue in the party or someone with thieves' tools that can actually go and lockpick. Or if the lock itself is an arcane lock and there is nothing actually to lockpick. What do you mean? As is the case with the cave around the mountain. Great. Now, though it works on both mundane and magical locks, if it is a magical lock that has kept this thing shut, it actually only suppresses that lock for about 10 minutes.
Ah.
During this time, you can just open the box freely or open the door freely, whatever it might be.
Open, close, open, close, open, close.
But after your 10 minutes is up, the arcane lock will lock itself again, and you're back to square one.
Oh, great.
Now, this is a great spell, except for the fact that it sucks if you're trying to be stealthy.
Huh?
Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the spell is named quite aptly. It's called Knock, and when you cast the spell, it creates a loud, audible knock that can be heard for up to 300 feet away. Extremely obnoxious and horrible, horrible, horrible if you are trying to actually stealth into someplace.
You noticed that? Oops.
There you have it. Knock. The perfect second-level spell to get through any pesky lock in front of you. Especially if your rogue is having performance anxiety.
I didn't mean it.
Or if they're off trying to calm an ogre by getting them to wear a tutu and convincing them they're a butterfly.
Be free.
Yeah, that never happened.
Sure didn't.
The spell would help the group get into the cave around the mountain. Though, to get through the second door, the markings made it appear that they would need something else. Something more powerful. Something unique. And as it turned out, the journal that Lucifer was looking through might just have the answer. It was a journal written by Ulagon Vesson himself, and had many different languages throughout it, from common to draconic to infernal, but between the group, they were able to read all three. They skimmed the book and discovered that much of it was a personal journal, and it spoke of quite a few things. It spoke of the finding of the floating islands around Reykjavir Mountain, and the founding of Skagakur, which occurred about a couple hundred years ago. It spoke of the other two founding members, Dabhar and Fasne, and a bit of Ulagon's own personal biases towards them. It spoke of Sago approaching the three founders in the early days, a seemingly tribalist core with much wisdom. It spoke of the door they'd seen earlier and a network of tunnels beneath the mountain. But more exciting than the image of the door was the spell that was on the opposite page. Lucifer wasn't able to decipher it, and so he showed it to the other casters within the group. But none of them were able to decipher it. No one seemed to have the right combination of abilities and languages that they needed. But they figured maybe it had to do with the door. Maybe they could use it to get through the door. They just needed someone to be able to read the spell. And since none of them could, maybe someone in the village could? As they skimmed further into the book, they realized that Ulagon had even recorded some disappearances and strange occurrences in Skagakur. This happened right as the tribes began to settle into the town, not long after the founding. At the same time, Ulagon mentioned how a symbol started cropping up. They realized that it was the symbol of a cult that had begun to surface. There was an image of the symbol in Ulagon's journal, a two-pronged rancier ending at red glowing eyes and a red tail with wicked barbs that encircled it. Oriana, our tiefling warlock, recognized the image as that of Fierna, the ruler of the fourth layer of the Nine Hells, daughter of Belial. They read more about the cult and the resistance that Ulagon, Sago, and other cores created to fight them. Ulagon himself created a dagger to combat the cult's summonings. An image of the dagger was in the book. It was a bronze dagger, on the hilt of which was the Vesson symbol, the one they had seen so many times on Yenna and Yaman's shoulder. Ulagon had made it to banish the devils from the material plane, but like all daggers, it could cut both ways. It could be used to summon as easily as it could be used to banish. At the very end of the journal, it changed handwriting. There was a note that Ulagon had died in the final battle with the cult, along with Dabhar Vitsni, one of the other founders. Ulagon died a hero. After this battle, the disappearances stopped, and life got back to normal. A lot of the information here seemed to resonate with the group, and they realized that this cult must be surfacing once again. Perhaps they were trying to get back at Ulagan by capturing his descendants. They weren't quite sure, but it seemed to make sense. The group was unsure of what to do next, when a loose page fell out of the back of the journal. It appeared to be another spell, one of Ulagan's own creation, but Clotho couldn't decipher it. And so, they added it to the list of spells that they needed someone else's help with. Funnily enough, they showed this particular spell to Clotho, but they didn't actually show it to Oriana. Oriana was a tiefling and knew the infernal language, which the spell was written in, and being a warlock, she would have been able to understand it. Alas, it was one of the few important mistakes that the group was about to make. Knowing that they needed some help with the spells, they turned to Vela and asked if she knew who might be able to read them. The monk knew of only 2 people in town who might have a shot at it. One was a wizard by the name of Layla. The second was Mebo. Though Vela did admit that as a monk, she wasn't tied into the magical networks of the town and spent most of her time here in Aisahrakur. They asked a bit more about Mebo and his magic. Half the group were surprised to realize that he was a bard. Like the ostentatious getup didn't give it away. They were wondering if they could get Layla or Mebo to come here to read the journal, but Vela informed them that if it would help the town with their issues, they could take the book, as long as it was returned and that Yenna knew where it was. The group was grateful, but very suspicious of the monk. So, to check their suspicions, they decided to trick the monk into entering the good alignment room, because, well, they figured if anyone in the cult would be evil in alignment and wouldn't be able to enter the room. And, well, this group was super suspicious of everyone. And when I say everyone, I pretty much mean everyone. The Oracle was shady. Mebo was shady. Every monk they had met up to this point was shady. Basically, anyone who wasn't cute little Nithni or the Vessens, since, well, the Vessens were the ones who were disappearing, they were all shady. And since they suspected everyone, they were bound to be right at least once. No? The question remained, though, if they were right, who were they right about? Was someone they met part of the cult? Take your bets now, people. Well, the senior monk was able to enter the room no problem, allaying the group's suspicions. Clotho just wanted to do one more thing before they left. Detect magic. And a good thing she did too. Clotho noticed that part of the unassuming wall of the library held a magical aura. Carrick and Ferox distracted Vela with some of the worst conversation yet about the architecture of the place, or the books, or the monk's training program, or something. I don't fully remember. But while they did this, Kumi, our ever-trusty rogue, was able to open the wall to find a secret passage. The rest of the party and Yenna snuck into the passage, which led to another cavern. It was a wide open space, with a large oblong smoothed-out area to one side. On the other side was a simple carpet with bed, nightstand, and bookshelf, though the furniture seemed way too small for the massive chamber. It took up only a minor fraction of it, rather like when a family sets up a viewing area on the side of a soccer or football field and only needs a little portion of the entire field. That's kind of what this looked like, but in a cave. With Detect Magic still up, Clotho noticed a magical wooden spoon on the bedside table. Kumi immediately went to steal it, but Yenna, who was very nervous about being in what she figured was Sago's bedroom, really didn't want to steal from such an esteemed member of Skagakur. In the end, though they intruded on Sago's personal quarters, they decided to respect his possessions and left the spoon where it was. When the party returned to thankfully end the horrid conversation that was happening in the library, Villa stopped the party at the exit and stared nervously at where they had come from. Yenna calmly assured the monk that nothing had happened and that the exploration was just to see if the devils had gotten in this way. She was sorry for the intrusion, but they realized that it wasn't a place for them. Watching Vella's body language, though, the party realized that she was hiding something, especially about the fight in Sago. Their suspicions were now piqued. With further prodding, they realized that Vella kept evading their questions, and she explained to them that it wasn't relevant to what they were doing. It wasn't relevant to the disappearances. And even though this group was trying to help, they were still outsiders, and it wasn't their place to know the secrets of this monastery. Realizing that, Vella wouldn't say anything without coercion, and not really wanting to coerce this monk, they asked Yenna if she could speak with Vella, core to core. Yenna pulled the monk aside and chatted with her. No one could see exactly what they were saying, but when they came back, Yenna explained that yes, she was hiding something, and no, it wasn't of any relevance to the mission, and it would be best if they left it be. The group accepted this and decided to drop it. And so the group left the monastery with Ulagon's journal in hand and a much better picture of the events that had transpired there. The group then decided to split apart and meet back at the Silver Scythe for the evening. Kumi, Lucifer, and Grim asked around town to find a blacksmith. Grim bought a few simple daggers and hand axes that he could throw, while Kumi got a dagger commissioned using the devil's stinger that he had collected from the monastery. I thought it was super cool. And a good thing that I didn't make them dissolve into piles of black ichor. The blacksmith told Kumi that he could come back in a day or two when he would be able to pick up his commissioned dagger. As the boys did their shopping, the girls searched for the wizard Layla. They wanted another person to be helping them, since some of the group still didn't trust Mebo. And so they didn't want to put all their rations in one basket, as it were, and that meant talking to Layla first. Asking around, they managed to find where the wizard was bundled up, meditating in a quiet patch of the forest. Layla took the journal and looked at the spell that the group indicated they needed help with. Unfortunately, she didn't know the right language, nor did she know anyone else in town who could help. Except for, you guessed it, Mebo. Carrick and Oriana were really not happy about this. But they didn't know what else to do at this point. And so they headed back to the Silver Scythe. With Carrick and Oriana grabbing a table for the group, meaning that these two players weren't actually present during this game, and with the boys still out on errands and checking out a few of the shops in town, it was down to Clotho and Ferox to speak with Mebo. They showed Ulagon's journal to Mebo, who was impressed at the find and eager to hear what they'd learned from the monastery. After telling Mebo about everything that had happened in the monastery, they asked about the 2 spells that they'd found in Ulagon's journal. The first spell, Mebo explained, was a way to get through a magical lock of Ulagon's own creation. He figured it must be the door in the image, which they knew to be the door in the cave around the mountain, the one that they had stopped by before getting to Skagakur. The second spell, that was a loose page in the back of the journal, he said it had to do with the banishing of devils, but it required a dagger and a bunch of things, and he didn't quite understand fully what it was. The group thanked him for the information, and they asked if he could help them decipher the spell to get through the cave. That way, with the knock spell that Clotho had just found, and this one, they'd be able to get into the tunnels that they figured were in the mountain. They believed that these tunnels were what the cult was using to move around the town, and that if they entered them perhaps they'd find them there. Mebo explained that, well, they had two options. Either A, he could come with them around the mountain to perform the spell to get them through the door, or he could try to transcribe the spell into a language they knew and would be able to use. But that option would take some time and money for the components to do such a thing. And he wasn't sure if it would work because of the fickle nature of magic and the translation from one language to another. Without the skeptical players present, Ferox and Clotho decided to give Mebo the book. They asked if he could do the translation tonight and have it for them by morning. Mebo knew he was in for a long night, but agreed. If it could save the village, it was worth it. Leaving the journal with Mebo, they went back to the table to chat with Carrick and Oriana, as the boys also came in to join them. When they'd all heard about what they'd agreed to do, there was a bit of an uproar, but they were able to calm down everyone else, explaining this was the only way they could do it. There was no one else. And besides, with the spell, they'd be able to get in the tunnels by themselves, and Mebo wouldn't have to join them. The group was arguing about why it was going to take so long and why it cost so much, but Clotho, being a wizard, knew that such translations could take hours, and it was perfectly understandable that it would take all night. This eased a bit of the suspicion from the others, and with a successful day at their backs, they settled in for a bit of fun in the evening. At Ferox's behest for musical entertainment, knowing that Mebo was now a bard, she asked him to give a small performance before going to work on the spell. The bard obliged. Mebo struck up a lively tune, and the tavern became alive with music. Dragonborn Ferox grabbed Yenna and pulled her up, and began a dance party, spreading out some of the other tables around the tavern so that they could enjoy themselves. Ferox dragged Yenna out to the dance floor, and a few of the other group members followed, including Grim, and they all danced kind of like what you see in a Charlie Brown film. One person head bobbing to one side, then the other, one kind of doing a Frankenstein walk, one kind of swaying back and forth, back and forth. Other corps joined in, enjoying the songs that were familiar classics in the town. During this time, the Oracle of Skreppa entered the Silver Scythe and went from table to table to table. Whispers slowly spread across the room as more eyes turned to Yenna and Ferox on the dance floor. The group started to realize that people were watching their own, so Kumi expertly went over to eavesdrop on the whispers and realized that the Oracle was telling everyone about the budding relationship between Yenna and Ferox, which now Kumi and the boys now figured out. Everyone was looking around, unsure of what this meant for the group, but it didn't seem to matter too much, because, after a few fun songs, Mebo called it a night and retired to work on the spell. Clotho did the same in order to add the knock spell to her spell book, so that they'd be fully able to get through the cave around the mountain. With the entertainment done for the evening, the others soon returned to their rooms in the Silver Scythe, and Ferox and Yenna headed out on their first official date, letting the others know that they'd meet them back here in the morning.
Ship, 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 ship.
Yenna and Ferox went off into the twilight for a lovely evening date. The night was calm. A few hooded figures passed them in the dark, moving purposely, not wanting to be seen or stay out long. But Yenna and Ferox had eyes for only each other. Yenna took Ferox to the equivalent of a shack selling slushy cones and brought her dragonborn date to a small remote floating island that they could call their own, even if only just for one night. They held hands and sat in silence, a cute romance blossoming. After the sweet evening, they headed back to Yenna's family home, with the thought of sneaking in so as not to awaken Yamin, their parents, or Nithni, while the rest of the party slept soundly in the Silver Scythe, halfway across town. Now, we're just going to pause here for a moment and take time to appreciate that many people who are listening fall into one of two categories. The first category is made up of people who are the dreamers, the romantics, the ones who still believe in happy ever afters. Very much like my players at this table, who are currently enjoying this lovely evening, super excited that they were finally shipping Yenna and Ferox. And then there's the other group, the hardened players, the cynics, the ones who've been screwed over way too many times by their DM to ever believe that anything good and beautiful could ever last. This is the category that I actually fell into at this moment. And those who are in this category might be thinking the same thing that I had been. Don't split the party! A common warning, known all too well by those who play these type of games, and have at some point, inevitably, learned this lesson after splitting their party apart to do different things when trouble was afoot. Now currently, I was screaming this internally while trying to keep a straight face, which, to my credit, I believe I did, because my players had no clue what was about to happen. Alas, every new player needs to eventually learn one of the golden rules of D&D. Don't split the party. Especially when you're hanging out with someone who's part of the family that's been slowly disappearing from this village, and that's why they brought you here in the first place. And now that you know that there's a cult who's resurfaced, who are likely the ones who've been taking these people and killing them or something. Yeah. Don't split the party. As Ferox and Yenna opened the door to the Vessin home, they stopped dead in their tracks. The place was in shambles. Tables were upturned. Arrows had been fired off. Ash and soot covered part of the rock. Yenna immediately ran to find Nithni, shouting for her niece, searching in her favorite hiding places. Ferox went to check the other rooms, but neither could find anyone. Nithni, Yamin, and Yenna's parents were all missing. They're so shocked and terrified that it didn't immediately clue into them. They weren't alone. Cultists who'd been hiding in the rooms stepped into the light as other cultists entered the dwelling and closed the door behind them, trapping Yenna and Ferox inside, alone, facing down a half-dozen cultists with nowhere to run. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Story of the Game. If you have any questions about the podcast or the game, please feel free to find me on Twitter at @D_Wolfsbane and pose your questions there. Alternatively, you can visit my website, dwolfsbane.com, and use the contact form. While there, you can also take a look at the character's stats for the game in the podcast section. Thank you so much for listening, and come join me next time to continue the disappearing debacle arc of Story of the Game. Labyrinth. I'm just going to say labyrinthine. I can't say it. Labyrinthine. Labyrinthine? No, we're just going to say labyrinth symbol. Good enough.